What does energy transition mean in Wyoming?
For Wyoming to see a significant increase in our wind capacity, we need probably three things.
The future of transporting fuel via pipeline.
To the extent that the Dakota Access Pipeline lowers transportation costs for vendors in the Bakken, it will raise the net price that they receive. And that will put upward pressure on net prices anywhere nearby, in particular in eastern Wyoming.
And Pete and Al Simpson's swan song.
For us, I think.
Yes, that's right.
I'll never forget when the cop car drove up to our home, Mother would cry. And finally, Pop one day gave the eternal parental lament. He said, "Where have we failed?"
Good evening. Welcome to this edition of Wyoming Signatures. I'm your host, Mary Jung. As the nation and the world transition to fuel choices that create fewer carbon emissions, Wyoming will face many challenges and opportunities. Fossil fuels will continue to be important for a long time, but Wyoming also has much to offer in terms of solar and wind power, as well as resources to develop new sources of energy. Wyoming Signatures' Pat Wolfinbarger found out from the director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, Mark Northam, how our state might adapt to changing economic and environmental demands.
What about the industries as a whole, natural gas, oil, and coal? How do you see the future evolving in Wyoming for those industries, and how does that compare to the views of 5 years ago?
Well, of course, all three are important contributors to the tax revenue streams to the state. Coal is probably the most challenged at the current time because coal volumes are down significantly from their peak about 4 years ago, and it appears that volumes will continue to decline depending upon let's say the aggressiveness of regulation and policy in the future. It's really a matter of volumes and prices. So we all know that the prices of all three, coal, natural gas, and oil, are down significantly from where they were 5 years ago. Natural gas, new discoveries of natural gas, or let's say new production of natural gas, continues to grow. So abundance and price will stay adequate, price will stay low for the foreseeable future. Oil price is down because there's an oversupply on the world market, and although some OPEC members are trying to tighten up supply, they have less control than they had at one point. So price won't vary tremendously from where it is today, hovering around $50 a barrel. So as I said, coal is the one that's probably the biggest unknown, but all indications are it's going to decline. None of that speaks well for the state's revenue streams looking to the near term. I do predict some recovery based on growth in demand and perhaps some tightening of supply in the oil arena. But the predictions today are very different from where they would have been 5 years ago when we were approaching the peak production and peak prices. Of course, it's always very difficult to predict things, especially the future, as Yogi Berra would say. So I'm not making any predictions, but the indications are that we're in for a period of low price, declining volumes, declining demand, and perhaps some continuing tough times for the state.
How well is Wyoming positioned to take advantage of renewable energy, wind, solar energy?
The three types of renewable energy that we really have some growth potential in are wind, which is our largest resource, solar, which is, at least at the utility scale, almost non-existent in Wyoming, and then geothermal, which is an unknown entity and probably farther from having a market presence in Wyoming. We could develop a tremendous quantity of wind in the state, but we're challenged with getting that wind energy to market. And of course, the entire country is expected to see a fairly significant growth in new wind capacity. And that starts to challenge the grid because of the intermittency. So in reality, for Wyoming to see a significant increase in our wind capacity, we need probably three things. One would be transmission capacity. There are 5 or so transmission lines headed to the west, the southwest, and the northwest that could carry new power. We need some type of viable economic storage, which is arguably still some years away. And of course, we need growth in demand for our power internally so that we can consume some of that energy internally. I do expect to see wind continue to grow. The availability of transmission and storage are going to be big determinants on how rapidly it grows. I don't think there is a significant potential for utility scale solar, and as I said, geothermal is still some years out.
So what kind of impact can regulations have, either restrictive or expanding these opportunities?
Yeah. The Clean Power Plan will probably be the single biggest stimulant for the development of renewables in the state of Wyoming because of our requirement under that plan, if it's upheld by the courts, to reduce our carbon footprint. And one of the ways we can reduce our overall carbon footprint, of course, is to build additional renewable capacity. So I hear some of the utilities talking about what their minimum expected build out of wind capacity will be in order to stay viable in the state of Wyoming, and they're pretty significant numbers. That single set of regulations alone will have, I think, in the next, let's say, 15 years, a fairly large impact on the growth of renewables in the state.
What kind of impact can technological changes and advances have on both our fossil fuel industries as well as the renewable energy industry?
Well, energy has always been a technology play. In the old days in oil and gas exploration and production, new technologies came around and opened up new potential and really caused some of the boom and bust cycles that we've experienced. It's going to take implementation of new technologies to keep coal as a viable clean energy resource. Things like new combustion processes, carbon dioxide capture, carbon dioxide utilization, carbon dioxide storage, all things that we're conducting research in right now, will be required to allow coal-fired power plants to meet their emissions targets. As I mentioned with renewables, the big issue is intermittency, and one of the most viable ways to deal with that intermittency is energy storage. We know how to store energy with battery technologies, but doing that at the utility scale is still a significant challenge. And so even with renewables, which seem to be at least the public's choice for energy of the future, there are very significant technology challenges, all of which need to be overcome in order for us to maintain our way of life, which means abundant, cheap supply of energy on demand.
Well, how broad is the work the School of Energy Resources is involved in, as well as the university here, in those challenges?
Because the energy resources are such an important part of the state's economy, We're clearly focused on keeping our fossil energy resources in the mix. That requires technology for managing emissions. But fossil energy resources are not an inexhaustible supply, and so we're also focused on ways to get more of the resource out of the ground, the already discovered resource out of the ground by enhanced recovery mechanisms. A big part of what we're doing today is looking at new processes that will allow us to take those resources and add value to them in the state, so that we're developing new markets for the resources, but also developing potentially new economic sector for the state in the manufacturing sector. All of those things are supported by the School of Energy Resources, with the generous support from the legislature, but also our partnerships with the private sector.
Well, Mark, again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Enjoyed being here.
Protesters continue to clash with bulldozers and police following the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's lawsuit to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. Proponents say the nearly $4 billion project will help close the gap between what we produce as a country and what we consume. The U.S. imports half of its oil currently, and depending on who you talk to, the DAPL could bring enormous economic benefits. Wyoming Signatures wondered what effect completion of this pipeline would have on our state. Our Rachel Wagner spoke earlier to the H.A. True Chair of Energy Economics at the University of Wyoming, Chuck Mason.
How much of a role will pipeline delivery of fossil fuels, or what is actually delivered this way, play in the future?
Well, I think pipeline delivery of fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, is the most cost-effective, most likely to be used transport method going forward. For natural gas, there's really no legitimate alternative, not within landlocked territories. We can send it overseas by liquefying it, but that's quite costly. For crude oil, there are really only two viable options. It's rail or pipeline. Each comes with some baggage, and we can talk a little bit more about that perhaps going forward. But for my money, the safety concerns and other kinds of issues that arise with rail delivery are paramount. And so my first choice, presumably on a broad scale basis, would be to use pipelines for delivering oil.
So going forward, you think we will see an increase in pipeline delivery?
I suspect as much. The advantages that rail has over crude oil have to do with its so-called nimbleness. It's easy to get oil delivered by rail. You don't have to have a pipeline kind of close at hand. And so as new finds come about, and they're remote relative to the existing stock of pipeline infrastructure, rail offers an attractive alternative. So, for instance, the oil extraction that was taking place around Douglas, north of Cheyenne, over the past few years has primarily been using rail for delivering the crude oil because there just isn't pipeline infrastructure there. And it's in an ongoing controversy with respect to the Bakken play.
Okay, so what's the economic effect of having an expansion of pipelines in the U.S.?
Well, I think the fundamental effect would be one of lowering delivery costs and thereby encourage expansion of extraction and production and things like that. The net price that firms receive for extracting resources takes, if you like, the kind of the final good price delivered to market, and from that subtracts transportation costs. Firms that are stuck using more expensive delivery modes then receive a lower net price. And so, for example, we see that the net price that interior extractors, like in Wyoming or in North Dakota, the net price that they realize tends to be substantially smaller than the delivered price, say, at the Cushing Trading Hub, the so-called West Texas intermediate price. And that discount is really to do with, that difference in price is really to do with a transportation cost adder.
Is it cheaper to deliver by rail or pipeline?
In general, it's cheaper to deliver by pipeline. There is the issue about how expensive pipelines are to lay, but from the perspective of the oil extracting company, that's a separate matter. That, what they care about is the rate that they're being charged. And generally speaking, it's cheaper to deliver by pipeline than by rail.
Okay. Is the economic effect of the expansion of the pipelines worth the environmental damage that could come out of it?
So this is always a question that's on the table. And as a result, the matters that come about when you think about building a new oil pipeline, you have to go through a number of steps. And included in that process is having the effects of the pipeline upon the surrounding territories, on peoples, on the environment. That all has to be kind of given its day in court, if you like. So one can imagine that there would be, in general, there are assessments of the impacts associated with pipelines, and if there are issues that arise from those assessments, that often will lead to an environmental impact statement. And one would imagine that thoughtful individuals looking at these things would say, oh, this is worth the cost, this is not worth the cost, this one gets built, this one doesn't get built.
So is the environmental risk higher with pipelines or lower with rail?
Yeah, so this is kind of an ongoing debate because both pipelines and rail delivery are subject to incidents, if you like, or spills. Rail cars can derail, and those tend to be kind of high-profile events when that happens. More generally, there are things that happen with rail delivery that get tabulated by the Department of Transportation, and they're more numerous than pipeline incidents, but many of those tend to be smaller. When pipelines burst or there's a leak, a breach, then the amount of oil that gets released can be quite large. And so there's something of an open question there as to which of these two venues is more dangerous, is riskier from an environmental perspective. I would suggest that the jury's still out on that.
Okay. So is the Dakota Access Pipeline really necessary? Is it worth the environmental risk?
Right. So the question that comes about with the Dakota Access Pipeline is really just kind of a focal point for the broader question of what's the best way to deliver crude oil from the Bakken. Is it best to send it by rail or is it best to send it by pipeline? And all these questions that you've raised, they come into play. Which is cheaper, which is riskier, and so there are all kinds of things that come to the fore. For my money, the concerns that have to do with safety issues from rail delivery and kind of the knockoff effects of having crude oil delivered by rail outweigh any risks that come about by having crude sent by pipeline. So we talked about the risks of derailment. The other issue that I would bring up that was in play to a certain extent a few years ago, less so now because there have been a slackening of deliveries from the Bakken. But when things were really hot and heavy, a lot of the historic customers of rail service, like agricultural interests in the Midwest, found that their shipments were being delayed because crude oil shipments were, as it happened, were taking precedence for whatever reason. So those sorts of effects are worth consideration. That doesn't come up with pipeline deliveries. Pipelines are delivering crude oil or natural gas, as the case may be. They're not being tasked for other things like delivering agricultural products, but rail can send many things. And so a fair question would be then, I think, is it better to use those pieces of infrastructure that are targeted to crude oil for delivering crude oil and those pieces of infrastructure that can do many things to pick up other delivery items like wheat, let's say, from North Dakota.
Okay. So would the Dakota Access Pipeline have any economic effect on Wyoming? Why or why not?
Right. I suspect that there will be no direct immediate effect, but I think there will be a knockoff effect. And the knockoff effect would be this. To the extent that the Dakota Access Pipeline lowers transportation costs for vendors in the Bakken, it will raise the net price that they receive. And that will put upward pressure on net prices anywhere nearby, in particular in eastern Wyoming, so around the Powder River Basin, in the plays that are outside of Cheyenne and Douglas. And I think those things are then ultimately going to lead to higher net prices for Wyoming producers. And some benefits will come out of that. I wouldn't expect those to be particularly large, though. I mean, we're not talking about massive increases in prices, but I think there will be an effect, a smallish effect.
So will the biggest economic effect be where the pipeline the states that the pipeline goes through?
Yeah, I think the biggest economic effect will be for sellers, crude oil producers who are operating in the Bakken, and buyers of that crude oil. And there are many, they're scattered across the country. Much of that action is in the Gulf Coast area. It's sent to refineries down in the Gulf Coast area. But a fair chunk of the output coming from the Bakken is going to East Coast refineries as well, and they'll benefit.
Okay, so if the pipeline is not completed in North Dakota, what does that mean?
It'll wind up having crude oil sent by rail. It'll be more or less business as usual. So, you might think about this as a missed opportunity for an enhancing of the conditions of trade within the United States.
In your opinion, what's the best way to deliver fossil fuels?
So, I take it that you mean here crude and natural gas.
Yes.
As I said before, there really are no options for natural gas. It has to be sent by pipeline. For crude oil, there is this trade-off between the nimbleness associated with delivery by rail and the kind of the lower delivery costs and, if you will, the lower risks associated with sending by pipeline. For me, this comes down in kind of on balance comes down in favor of sending stuff by pipeline, but going forward, there have been pressures to enhance the safety features of rail cars, and to the extent that that becomes an important attribute, let's say in 5 years or so, that could arguably change the calculus, and one might imagine under those circumstances that there might be a preference for sending stuff by rail.
Okay.
At present, I would say pipeline.
Okay. Chuck, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
The Simpson family has a long and rich history in our state. Some of them platted and named Jackson, Wyoming, while others advised the great Shoshone chief Washakie and New Sacagawea. In modern times, the name Simpson signifies public service and politics. Alan Simpson has had a long, successful tenure in the U.S. Senate, in addition to holding state office and a law career. His brother Pete, the historian, supported the University of Wyoming in various administrative roles, as well as serving in the State House before running for governor in 1986, a race he lost against Democrat Mike Sullivan. One thing Pete and Al have never lost is their sense of humor, which is all too evident in this excerpt from what may be their last public performance.
Oh, you can't do this without a supportive spouse. Let me tell you, if you want to do politics, without a supportive spouse, go into some other line of work. Anyway, so Ann Shavish, that couple over there, they keep looking over. They know that you know. So, Dad was almost a ventriloquist. He'd walk down the street and he'd say, "Who's the big lord ass with the who's the guy walking toward us with the hat?" And Steve from Steve, how are you? God, it's good to see you. That always worked. I could master that. It was so marvelous. Where was I? I was telling you that. Yes. What
about the Mayflower Cafe?
Oh, yes. At the woman, and we went over and I said, "How do you do? Nice to see you." And she pulled back, and her husband kind of looked like he knew what was coming. She said, "You people are all alike. You come wandering over, pretend you know who we are. You have no idea who we are, Malcolm." And I said, "Lady, I've been waiting for you for a lifetime. You don't know who the hell I am." Boy, I tell you, but it felt good. It really did.
Al has had pungent phrases in his political career, pungent lines here and there. But you got to admit that the book you wrote about riding the old gazoo has pungency that others might not have.
Of course it does.
And I remember when he walked out onto the sidewalk in Washington, and Washington Post, it was during the Iran-Contra hearing, and they were asking Reagan questions, and you're not supposed to do that at a photo op. So Al walked out on the street behind this press guy, and he was grimacing with his hand in the air and said, "All you try to do is stick it in the president's kazoo." Well, Ted Koppel on Nightline got wind of this, and he called Al and said, "Like to have you come on Nightline." So on Nightline he said, "Senator, we're wondering, what is a kazoo?" And he said, I called your mother and asked her, and of course, Mom had given lecture 120 to Al about being a nice guy in public, and so, and she said that it's a musical instrument. Is that right, Senator? And Al said, well, it's a wind instrument.
I did say that. Oh, words to live by.
Words
to live by. Well, now you told that one. I was just thinking, Peter, we're watching. Oh, yes, Ben isn't even up yet.
Well,
But we're winding it up. But really, people ask me about politics, and here is the definition. And you don't need to know any more, whether you're gnashing your teeth about this election or what's coming or where's America. In politics, there are no right answers. Only a continuing flow of compromises among groups, resulting in a changing, cloudy, and ambiguous series of public decisions where appetite and ambition compete openly with knowledge and wisdom. That's all there is.
Great definition. Great definition. Well, Al, I hate to bring this to a close, but I'm going to quote a great phrase, the best commencement advice Al and I ever got.
Really?
Yes, was in
I don't
Cody,
remember any of my
Wyoming.
commencement speakers.
The only one I remember was, and it wasn't from the speaker. It was from Glenn Livingston at the edge of the podium when we got our diplomas and walked off, and his advice was, keep moving.
Keep moving. Now, the witching hour is coming, and we have, well, we used to fight. Our boys fought, Bill and Colin, and they fought till they were big enough to hurt each other, and so did Pete and I fight until he really hammered me. I cannot remember the blood gushing from my nose, but he does. And then he knew that...
The arm. It was the skinning of the arm. I was faster, but he just took the skin all off my arm. I hit his nose and blooded his nose, and he blooded my... And we were big enough to hurt each other. That was enough.
You look like you still enjoyed that.
I have a...
That was Alan and Pete Simpson entertaining the audience at a University of Wyoming Foundation event a few weeks ago. Well, thank you for watching this edition of Wyoming Signatures. Until next time, I'm Mary Young, wishing you happy trails for everyone here at UW-TV.